Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, and this is the next reading in part 4 of the book. What should I do, and who should I be? So it's the ethical question of the 4 fundamental questions. And this ethical dilemma is occurring on the porch of the king of Archon. So this is in front of the courthouse where Socrates was later found guilty of corrupting the youth and believing in gods of his own invention instead of the gods of the state. So later this day, this is just before Socrates gets convicted. So that's an important piece of the story, because while he's waiting to go in, he meets a young man named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro says, what are you doing here, Socrates? I know you would never bring a lawsuit against anybody. And Socrates says, certainly not. Well, then what's going on? And he says, oh, a certain young man named Meletus has found him guilty of corrupting his young friends and being an inventor of his own gods. Now, Euthyphro fancies himself to be a great theologian and someone who has the ability to foretell the future, but by reading the dialogue you get the picture that he's a kind of a town fool and people laugh at him. And so Socrates ironically refers to that occasionally throughout the dialogue. If you read here on the about halfway down page 414, Euthyphro, after hearing Socrates explain the charges that are being leveled against him, he says, I understand, Socrates, he means to attack you about the familiar sign which occasionally, as you say, comes to you. So Socrates used to say he'd have a voice, his daimon would tell him when not to do things. So if he would start to say something and then he would get this voice in his head, then he would stop. And if he would start to do something and he wouldn't get that voice, then he would assume that's approval from the gods or from God, and he would continue to talk. So after he mentions that, Euthyphro, talking about the person who's accusing Socrates of these crimes, he says, he thinks that you are a neologian, someone who creates new gods, and he's going to have you up before the court for this. He knows that such a charge is readily received by the world, as I myself know too well. For when I speak in the assembly about divine beings and foretell the future to them, they laugh at me and think me a madman. So then Socrates, ironically at the bottom of the page, says, I dare say not, for you are reserved in your behavior and seldom impart your wisdom. So Socrates is telling Euthyphro, you seldom impart your wisdom because you really don't have any wisdom. But I have a benevolent habit of pouring out myself to everybody and would even pay for a listener, and I am afraid that the Athenians may think me too talkative. Then Euthyphro says, I dare say that the affair will end in nothing, Socrates, and that you will win your cause. I think that I shall win my own. So Socrates definitely does not win his cause. Euthyphro's proven that he cannot foretell the future. That's what Plato was intending for us to figure out here by reading that. Then Socrates says, okay, well, what brought you here? And then he says, oh, I'm leveling charges against my father. I'm accusing him of murder. And then Socrates says, your father? My good man. What happened? And then so Euthyphro tells the story, well, we had, if you read on page 415, the bottom paragraph, he says, the real question is whether the murdered man has been justly slain. If justly, then your duty is to let the matter alone. But if unjustly, then even if the murderer lives under the same roof with you and eats at the same table, proceed against him. Now the man who is dead was a poor dependent of mine who worked for us as a field laborer on our farm in Naxos. And one day, in a fit of drunken passion, he got into a quarrel with one of our domestic servants and slew him. My father bound him hand and foot and threw him into a ditch, and then sent to Athens to ask of a diviner what he should do with him. And then meanwhile, his father didn't take care of the murderer, who was dead by the time the person returned from Athens with a word from the diviner. I guess they sent someone to the oracle, maybe the oracle at Delphi, to ask advice about what should be done with the murderer. And so Euthyphro is now leveling charges of murder against his father. And Socrates says, at the top of page 416, "Good heavens, Euthyphro, and is your knowledge of religion and of things pious and impious so very exact that supposing the circumstances to be as you state them, you are not afraid lest you too may be doing an impious thing in bringing an action against your father?" And then Euthyphro says, "Socrates, the best of Euthyphro, and that which distinguishes him from other men is his exact knowledge of all such matters. What should I be good for without it?" Then Socrates says, "Rare friend, oh, you must instruct me about piety. Then I can defend myself when I go to court." So Socrates is being ironic. He knows that Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about. Everyone laughs at him like a madman. And I think it's important here to note that Socrates has a pretty good idea. He's going to be found guilty in his court hearing and that he'll be sentenced to death. And yet, as always, he's concerning himself with others, trying to teach them that they're not wise. That was what Socrates will say in his court hearing later on, after he has this conversation with Euthyphro. So, rather than worrying about his own imminent demise, he's just carrying on trying to instruct whoever he happens to meet in town, and this time it's Euthyphro. So he says, tell me, what is piety? And then at the bottom of page 416, Euthyphro says, "Piety is doing as I am doing, that is to say, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or of any similar crime, whether he be your father or mother or whoever he may be, that makes no difference, and not to prosecute them is impiety." So Socrates, over on 417, about 3/4 of the way down, he says, "Remember that I did not ask you to give me 2 or 3 examples of piety, but to explain the general idea which makes all pious things to be pious. Do you not recollect that there was one idea which made the impious impious and the pious pious?" Euthyphro says, "I remember. Tell me what is the nature of this idea, and I shall have a standard to which I may look, and by which I may measure actions, whether your actions or those of anyone else, and then I shall be able to say that such and such an action is pious, such another impious." So what is the general idea that you can then use as a standard to measure every action or whether or not it's pious? No, excuse me. So Euthyphro says, "Very well, I'll give you a definition like you're asking for." The bottom of 417, "Piety, then, is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them." So Socrates then says, "Good, that's the kind of a definition I wanted, but let's see if it's true or not." And then he points out, well, piety is what's dear to the gods, and impiety is what's not dear to them, but don't the gods disagree about things? So Euthyphro says, well, according to the Athenian religion, Zeus killed his father, Kronos, who in turn had killed his father, Uranus, and therefore it's okay to, if you look at the well, then here's what Socrates will say about that. On page 419, about halfway through that paragraph where Socrates starts to talk, he says, "And therefore, Euthyphro, in thus chastising your father, you may very likely be doing what is agreeable to Zeus, but disagreeable to Kronos, or Uranus, and what is acceptable." All right, so the gods disagree about what piety is. So if you say the definition of pious is what the gods agree on, is what pleases them, well, it pleases Zeus to kill his father because his father had devoured Zeus's siblings, but it wouldn't be a good idea from Kronos' perspective, so that can't be the definition of piety. So then they go through all these other, Socrates keeps asking, try to tell me what it is, I know you know, so don't be miserly with your wisdom, share it with me. Of course, he knows that Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about. And so in the end, after going through all these, the argument keeps turning in circles, Euthyphro says on page 426, so Socrates asking, piety then is pleasing to the gods, but not beneficial or dear to them? I should say that nothing could be dearer. Then once more the assertion is repeated that piety is dear to the gods. Euthyphro, certainly. And when you say this, can you wonder at your words not standing firm, but walking away? Will you accuse me of being the Daedalus who makes them walk away, not perceiving that there is another and far greater artist than Daedalus who makes them go round in a circle? And he is yourself, for the argument, as you will perceive, comes round to the same point. Were we not saying that the holy or pious was not the same with that which is loved of the gods? Have you forgotten? So then Socrates says, what is piety? That is an enquiry which I shall never be weary of pursuing as far as in me lies, and I entreat you not to scorn me, but to apply your mind to the utmost and to tell me the truth. I am confident you would never, on behalf of a serf, have charged your aged father with murder if you didn't know what piety is. So just don't hide your knowledge from me, Euthyphro. And then Euthyphro finally says, another time, Socrates, for I am in a hurry and must go. So he left. Euthyphro could not define what piety is, and he was through being shown how ignorant he really was, and so he left. And all right, so with that, we'll go to these discussion questions. On page 429, why does Socrates reject Euthyphro's first definition of piety? Explain. Because it was just an example, not a definition. He said, piety is prosecuting people for murder, even if it happens to be your father. And then Socrates says on page 417, remember, I didn't ask you for 2 or 3 examples, but the general idea, which makes all pious things to be pious, one idea that can serve as a standard by which to measure all actions to see whether or not they're pious. So that's why Socrates rejected that first definition. Number 2, discussion question number 2, why does Socrates reject Euthyphro's last definition? He rejects the last definition because it's a repeat. He's just saying again the second definition. So after Socrates rejected the first definition because it was just an example, then Euthyphro says, okay, piety then, this is the bottom of 417, piety then is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. Socrates says, well, it's dear to, what is dear to some gods is odious to others, and vice versa, so that can't be the definition. Then they go through other definitions. Each time Socrates points out a flaw with it, and the conversation somehow or other comes full circle back again to Euthyphro repeating that piety is that which is pleasing to the gods. And so Socrates had already refuted that definition, and then he says, well, you know, you're accusing me of being this mythological creator of fantastic machines, like the maze that the Minotaur walks around in and nobody can get out, yet you're the one who's making this conversation go around in circles. That is what Socrates says to Euthyphro, although it's Socrates is himself famous for doing that, and Euthyphro even accused him of that earlier, and that's what Socrates was referring to. He says on page 422, Euthyphro says, I really do not know, Socrates, how to express what I mean, for somehow or other our arguments, on whatever ground we rest them, seem to turn round and walk away from us. So that leads to this third discussion question on page 429. Why is it so difficult to define abstract nouns such as piety? Explain. So there's no definite answer written in the text here. It's Plato is demonstrating how difficult it is to define abstract nouns such as piety or justice or any of these absolute ideas that Socrates bases his philosophy in. How do you define them? Sure, you've got a word, the idea of the good, but what is the idea of the good? It's the source of all of the other absolute ideas? Okay. Well, what are those? Can you define any of them, such as, for example, the idea of piety? And then, of course, no one ever can adequately define any of these absolute ideas. It's similar to the Tao Te Ching. It starts out by saying the Tao cannot be named. If you want to give a word to what we're talking about, call it the Tao, but what it is in itself cannot be expressed in words. So why is it so difficult to define abstract nouns? So what does abstract mean? Take something out of its context. We talked about that with Grace Clement's article, which is the last one for part 4 of the book that I started with so that you could be prepared for the discussion forum. It's the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. The ethic of justice wants to abstract the ethical situation out from its context to reduce it to some universal principles. But it's difficult to define an abstract noun, because when you're defining things, you're always comparing them to other things. We went over this before with Henri Bergson, with his thoughts about analysis and intuition. And I will turn to that. I believe it's page 213. So, I just use this to explain why it's impossible to define the Tao. This is the same basic question. Two types of knowing that he described were analysis, which is knowing something from outside, looking at it from relative points of view, and then using symbolic language to describe it. The problem with that is symbols such as, to say something is red, the word red applies to a lot of different things. So it's, this pen is a red pen. But, this book here has a red spot on the top. So any symbolic word, any noun or adjective you use to describe something can be also applied to an infinite number of other things. It never tells you what the thing is in itself. And that's the limitation of symbolic language. You'll never be able to describe what's unique about something using symbolic language. The only way to know something as it is in itself is through what Bergson calls an intuition. You have to become the thing. But then, even if you get that knowledge, you would not be able to translate it adequately back into words. But you could use words to help people have the intuition of what you're trying to communicate. And that's the single goal of philosophers, says Bergson. If you look on page 213, the bottom paragraph, he says, here the single aim of the philosopher should be to promote a certain effort which in most men is usually fettered by habits of mind more useful to life. Now the image has at least this advantage, that it keeps us in the concrete. No image can replace the intuition of duration. By duration, he means the duration of your own self-awareness from moment to moment. But diverse images borrowed from very different orders of things may, by the convergence of their action, direct consciousness to the precise point where there is a certain intuition to be seized. Similarly, it seems that Socrates is zeroing in. What is piety? What is piety? What is piety? You'll never describe it with words, but he's hoping to create the condition in Euthyphro's mind where he can have an intuition of what piety is. Or at least get him to realize he doesn't know and needs to investigate more deeply than he has. So these abstract nouns, those are what Socrates calls the absolute ideas. Any pious action that anyone has ever perpetrated gets its existence by participating in the absolute idea of piety, the perfect concept of piety that all pious actions have in common. And all of those abstract concepts, those absolute ideas, according to Socrates in the cave allegory in the Republic, originate in the idea of the good. To turn the eye of the soul inward towards that supreme absolute idea would give you knowledge. It would give you an intuition of all these other abstract perfect concepts, but you would never be able to describe them with words, but you might be able to use words to prepare people for this kind of an intuition. Okay, so the next reading will be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, parts of his Nicomachean Ethics, and that's where we will pick it up.